Today we meet a guy called Nehemiah. In Hebrew, it's pronounced Nehemiah. Yah comforts. Yah stands for Yahweh. And Nehemiah completes the third part parallel of the two books, Ezra and Nehemiah. Same story setting, different time period. First part, Zerubbabel built the temple. Then Ezra comes in to establish the law. And now Nehemiah would come in to build the walls of Jerusalem. So if you look at the two lines of Ezra and Nehemiah in the picture, you will see that both lines lead to this influential figure called King Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was the number six king of the Persian Empire, the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire. He was the grandson of Darius I. He was the son of Xerxes I and his wife, Amestris. So back to Artaxerxes. He would be instrumental in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Remember, Ezra had traveled to Jerusalem on the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign in Ezra chapter 7, and he had the letter of endorsement giving safe passage and the command of toll-free, tax-free, tribute-free for priests and temple workers. Now, fast forward 13 years later, Nehemiah would serve in the palace of the same king, Artaxerxes I. Nehemiah chapter 1 puts us in a place called Susa, Babylon. It's the same place that the prophet Daniel received the revelation or the vision in Daniel chapter 8. And here it is the month of Kislev, the third month, and Hanani, his relative, which he calls brother, came to him from Judah with some news. The remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. And when Nehemiah heard these words, he sat down and he wept and mourned for days. And he fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah was happily serving in Babylon. He wasn't one of those that went back, serving in Babylon. And now, why would he be distressed? Was it because Jerusalem was in ruins? Or was it because the remnant were in great distress? Perhaps God was stirring his heart, telling him to do something about it. So he started praying. He started praying for mercy and forgiveness. And that is how their line of prayers were in the past. They would ask for forgiveness, mercy, confess their sins of their ancestors. And then they will always remind God of his covenant with his people. And then asking God, hey, God, pay attention to my prayers. Let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, said humbly. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. And then there was a statement. I was the cupbearer to the king. So what success was Nehemiah praying about? And who is this man he was referring to? Yes, Cindy, it's the king. So is a cupbearer a high or a low position? A cupbearer was historically an officer of high rank in the royal courts. And his duty was to pour and serve drinks at the royal table. But in the courts is a high-ranking officer. Why? Because if you were the king or the queen, and your life was in constant fear of plots and betrayals, which were those days, that came commonly through poisoning, you would want a thoroughly trustworthy person to hold that position, wouldn't you? To supervise your food, especially the drinks that you love. So the cupbearer would guard against the poison in the king's cup and was sometimes required to swallow some of the drink before serving it. So the cupbearer would have to have confidential and trusted relations with the king, which often gave him a position of great influence. So here was Nehemiah, a cupbearer with influence and chosen by God for a mission. But it took him 3 months to plan what he would do. So comes the month of Nisan, and that was the king's 20th year. He brought the cup to the king with a very depressed look. And the king noticed it because that wasn't him. He started to worry about Nehemiah, see how close they were, and asked him, what is wrong? What is wrong? And then Nehemiah answers, may your majesty live forever. How can I help looking sad when the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king said to me, what would you request? And listen to this. So I prayed to the God of heaven. He did a silent prayer because the golden opportunity had come. And Nehemiah had to seize that opportunity, but not without God's help. So he said a silent prayer in his heart. And then he opened his mouth and he requested of the king. And I said to the king, if it pleases you, my lord, the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. And the king just asked, how long do you want to go? And when will you return? So Nehemiah gave him the time, and then he went on and asked further. This was his opportunity. And he says, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, the Trans-Euphrates region, that they may let me pass through. And then another letter to Asaph, keeper of the forest, because he wanted timber to build. They needed timber to make beams for the fortress gates, the wall, and for his house. The king agreed, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Here was a faithful servant of the king who had served honestly and earned the loyalty of the king. Above all, he was a faithful servant of Yahweh and had earned the favor of Yahweh. Why did Nehemiah need a letter to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates or beyond the river region to let him pass through? Were they going to obstruct him? Yes or no? How do we know that there's danger ahead? Where is a clue that there was obstruction? If you remember the out of place letter of complaint in EZRA 4:6, remember that strange letter that was placed, I told you wrongly, in terms of timeline? The contents were not wrong, but the timeline. And I asked you to caveat that, quarantine that, put that letter aside, because that letter would come in this time. That letter was a letter of complaint sent to King Artaxerxes by the officials of the Trans-Euphrates region. Their names, Bishlam, Mithredath, Tabeel. These are all officials. Rehum, the commander, and Shimshai, the scribe from the Trans-Euphrates region. You see, they had convinced the same king to put a stop work order on the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. And they cited past rebellion and loss of revenue. You can go back and read EZRA 4:7-23. And the picture will come in now. And the king, in verse 21, the king gave the order to cease the rebuilding work until further instructions. Now, this would have happened earlier in his reign. And he had listened to the officials and he had not done any investigation into the matter. So time may have passed and the king would have forgotten about it. He forgot about it, but not Nehemiah. And definitely not the enemies at the Trans-Euphrates region. They were still around. So this letter that Nehemiah requested was definitely going to be a safe passport. And not only that, Nehemiah also requested the escorts of the officers of the king's army and the horsemen to guard him. So God had used Nehemiah's influence in the king's court to eliminate the obstacles set by the enemies. So for Nehemiah, the journey was smooth from Susa back to Jerusalem. And straight after 3 days after he arrived, he got to work. He got up during the night. He brought a few men along. He didn't tell them what God had set out to do. He didn't tell anybody what his plan was. He went out at night and he inspected the wall at the valley gate, the dung gate, up to the king's pool. Then he approached the leaders and the officials. He told the officials and the nobles, he said, you see here, we have a problem. Jerusalem is desolate. Its gates are burned. Come on, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that this reproach will not continue. That means we will not continue to be insulted, humiliated, intimidated by the enemies. And then he related to these guys how the good hand of God was with him and what the king had said to him. And what was the people's reply? Let's do it. The people replied, let's do it right away. You see, they had tried to start the rebuilding years ago, right? And they were hindered by the latter and all that. And now Nehemiah had come to rally them once again. It's not that they didn't want to, they just discouraged. They gave up hope. And here was a man, a brave and faith-filled man, come to motivate them to get started again. So they readied themselves for this good project. But whenever you want to do something, somebody's will come along. Somebody's. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, Gershom the Arab heard about it, they laughed at us, mocking. So what do you think you're doing? Do you think you can cross the king? See, they still thought that the king had stopped the project. So Nehemiah just stood there and he responded, the God of heaven will prosper us. We will start and you have no right in Jerusalem. So it was Nehemiah's strong and courageous leadership that stood firm and was not intimidated by those who wanted to sabotage the work. Do we have that in our church today? Do we need strong leadership in our churches today? Yes, definitely. We need strong leaders, but most of all, we need dedicated workers. Next chapter, chapter 3, will list down all the men who had a part to rebuild the walls. You see, Nehemiah, he couldn't do it himself. He had to garner the people, and the people were ready. This is a busy chart. Okay, you can snapshot it and you can go and see it later. It's a very busy chart because it was very busy work for them in chapter 3. It starts there. The old city of Jerusalem is only about 0.9 kilometers square. So let's start with Eliashib. You see, they had planned and they delegated and they distributed the work. Eliashib was the high priest. He and his team built the sheep gate. Wait, we have to go anti-clockwise, okay? Turn left. Then we will have the men of Jericho. Then you have Hasanaah. They will build the fish gate. By the way, the sheep gate is the place they brought in the sheep. The fish gate was the place they brought in the fish. So naturally, this was how they named the gates. And then we have different people volunteering, conscripted too, from the high priest. Then we have goldsmith, you have traders of perfumery, you have Levites, you have normal people, you have families, you have all that. Then I read Meremoth, Meshullam, Zadok, Uzel. I don't have all the names, but I have put most of the names there. Then the broad wall, then the corner gate, then the tower, and then you come down to Shalom. I like Shalom because why? He built a big part of it. And because he built it with his daughters. And then you come down all the way to Valley Gate. You have Hanum. City walls. Down south, you have Zanoah. And then you have the Dung Gate. Guess what the Dung Gate is used for? Malkijah. And then you turn up. And then you will see a whole lot of arrows there, right? That is the city of David. That's where King David stayed. Then after that, we move up to Zadok, and we get nearer to the Horses Gate, and then you can see the Mount of Olives, and across there you can see the temple. That's how Jesus from the Mount of Olives walked down to the temple, but he used the East Gate below the Sheep Gate. Nobody felt that he was too good or too lowly. Everyone did their part. Sanballat again, they were heard that they're rebuilding the wall. He became so angry and so upset. And he made fun of the Jews in the presence of his colleagues and even had the Samaria army with him, calling them feeble Jews. And what did the Jews do? They didn't retaliate. They just prayed and they continued. So we rebuilt the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height. And the people were enthusiastic. Listen to this. The people worked with all their hearts. That's how you can complete a project. If the people work as a team with all your hearts and enthusiasm, despite opposition. The enemies continue to plot. They continue to plot. They continue to conspire together in verse 8 to fight against Jerusalem with armed forces to hinder it. And Nehemiah, he stationed a guard to protect them 24/7, day and night. Then there was negative talk starting to come in. And the negative talk started to set in internally. The people of Judah started to say, hey, you know, the strength of the laborers, we're getting tired. There's so much rubble. We cannot build. We cannot do this. We cannot do that. The enemies were saying, They will not know when, and we are going to kill them. We are going to attack them, and we're going to stop work. So there was a lot of pressure coming in from outside and inside. What would you do if you were Nehemiah? He just focused on what he had to do. He set guards in the lowest parts of the space, the walls, the open spaces, and he got family groups with swords, spears, and bows ready to defend. He was going to stand up and defend. And when he had made an inspection, he stood before them and he gave them this wonderful speech. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the great and awesome Lord. Fight on behalf of your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your families. If anyone is attacking your family, anyone is attacking your church, fight to defend them. That's what Nehemiah says. And for us, if Satan is attacking your family, stand and pray for God to defend and protect your family. Don't be discouraged. Don't give up. So with that, from that day on, half the men were doing the work, half the men holding spears, shields, bows. Those who were carrying loads, they did that. One hand work, one hand spear. The builders had their swords strapped on their sides. And Nehemiah said, look, the work is demanding. If they come and attack us, let's get the trumpet. When you hear the sound of the trumpet, all gather together in here. Our God will fight for us. If the enemy attacks all around, gather together. God will fight for us. So what did they do? They stayed and they worked from dawn to dusk. And they were workers by day and guards by night. And most of them did not even go home to change clothes. And each of them had their weapon every moment. What dedication. So that's the end of chapter 4. So as we end this class, I want you to always remember this verse. We may not be building the walls of Jerusalem, but we definitely are going through circumstances. And whatever circumstances you are going through, whatever opposition or obstacles you are going through, remember, stand up. Don't be afraid of them. Whatever it is, whoever it is, whatever circumstance, remember the great and awesome God. He is great and awesome, and he will fight on behalf of your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your husbands, and your family.